So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, "What's your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Up to half of my kingdom, it shall be done." Then Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss." Then King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he, who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing?" And Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he also assault the queen while I am in the house?" As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, "Look, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman." Then the king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. Now let's go to the next book just for an illustration of what I want to say tonight. Book of Job, over a couple of pages, just to the right. And Job has lost a lot of things in his family, his business. And all this bad news comes in upon him. Verse 20 of chapter 1, "Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshipped." That's on hearing the news. "And he said, 'Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.' In all this, Job did not sin, nor charge God with wrong." That's all we read. When Ernest Hemingway was wounded in the First World War, the doctors picked 237 pieces of shrapnel out of his body. And he never forgot the experience. It wasn't so much the memory of the pain of the shrapnel in him that he remembered. What particularly stayed with him was that he had come very close to death. And the man that he was with in the hospital ward where he recuperated had had the same experience. And he felt, because he had been very close to death, that he was set apart from other men. And that the men who were with him, and anybody that he met who had had a close brush with death, were different to people who had never had the experience. From this, Ernest Hemingway wrote his great novels, some of the most famous novels in modern literature, English literature, on a formula. His novels are written around a formula: For Whom the Bell Tolls, The Old Man in the Sea, etc., etc. He said, put a good man in a situation where he comes face to face with death, and then you'll see him at his truest and deepest dimensions. You'll find out just how good he really is The trial of being close to death, he said, won't break him, it won't make him, it will reveal him. And he believed that. And of course, we know all through those famous occasions whenever he, used to get into bullfighting and all sorts of things. Dicing with death and how men behaved when faced with death fascinated him. If you were told that you would die before midnight tonight, wonder how you would spend the next couple of hours or so. Wonder how you'd react. Well, just feel that emotion in your heart and then transform it into this book of Esther, and you will see Esther and every Jew from India to Ethiopia facing a situation when in 9 months, on a certain day, it would be lawful to kill them. As an edict, as a law. And if Hemingway says it reveals a person, I'll tell you one thing, it certainly revealed Esther. She was faced with certain death and her people, and she reacted in an amazing way. But it seems to me, looking at the book of Esther, it wasn't even so much the fact that she was facing death and her sterling worth in the face of it that came to the surface only. It was the way that Esther waited for God and was able to tolerate the silence of God. See, the Christian faith is a very wonderful faith, and it's filled with joy, and it's filled with hope, and it's filled with wonderful encouragement. But the Christian faith also, for those who believe it, creates problems that the unbeliever doesn't have. I am told that there were people who lost their Christian faith in Ethiopia whenever they saw the little children dying in recent droughts, and there was no answer from heaven. I saw a friend of mine not very long ago stand in the teeth of one of the most difficult situations I've ever seen anybody stand, and my friend just stood there and just shook the head, unable to say anything, because of the ferocity of the tragedy that that person was facing. And no matter how much prayer had gone up, there was no answer to alleviate it. See, the unbeliever says, well, you win some and you lose some, and droughts come and droughts go, and that's the way it is, and you evolve from a protoplasm in the ocean, and that's really all you are anyway. You're only an animal, and they don't have a problem with it. But for a person who believes there is a loving God behind the universe, it is a problem. God's silence in the face of suffering is a very difficult thing to understand. You know that lovely hymn that I have put on your note sheet there, a verse of it? In His time, He makes all things beautiful in His time. Lord, please show me every day as you're teaching me your way that you do just what you say in your time. Beautiful. Yet the words are very hard to sing without divine accompaniment. And when no notes from heaven cue you and keep you in key to sing it. You imagine how difficult it was for Esther and Mordecai to sing a song like that. He does everything beautiful in his time. Because in chapter 3 and verse 1, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. And this man is planning to annihilate every Jew in the empire. And he's promoted higher and higher and higher. And God is silent. Hard to take. One of the wickedest men who ever walked the face of the earth, a scoundrel, is promoted to the very highest position next to the king in the country, and God says nothing. Maybe on a smaller scale that has happened in your office. That has happened in your business. That has happened in your world. Where men who fiddle income tax, men who blaspheme all day long, men who couldn't care less about God, His Bible, His gospel, or whatever, and they soar to the top in their careers. And those who try to pay their taxes, those who don't blaspheme, those who try to be honest and stand up for truth, never get a career break. And God does nothing and says nothing, and no miracle interposes. Hard to take. And when you come to chapter 3 and verse number 6, where he disdains to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. Not only is he wicked in his heart, now he's planning to do it. And in 3 verse 6, God is still silent. And then when you come from verse 9 down to verse 11, and the king agrees with what he's planning and puts it into operation, God is still silent. And when Mordecai comes along to plead with Queen Esther to go in and intervene with the king, she equivocates. She turns and churns with it for a little while with the problem. And in chapter 4, there is still no word from God. And of course, we know that God is never mentioned from the beginning of the book of Esther to the end. He's never mentioned. So much so that many theologians don't believe that this book should be in the Bible. If you want to put it straight, it's one of the most seemingly un-evangelical books that ever has been written. Here is a girl who is married to a heathen king who entered a harem of women in order to do it, which would be distinctly against God's word. She's having banquets of wine. She's seemingly breaking every rule in the book. She doesn't fit the mold. She doesn't fit your average Christian biography or missionary biography or anything you've ever read in your dad's library or in Christian magazines. This book is one of the strangest books ever to be placed within the canon of Scripture, which I firmly believe it should be there. And we've talked about that before. But I've got to be honest and I've got to be real and say, what on earth is going on? Esther seems to be breaking a whole lot of rules. Worship is never mentioned. And yet here is this girl who, in the overruling of God in her circumstances, comes into a situation where she does one of the most wonderful things any woman has ever done, any believer has ever done. For I have no doubt that Esther was a believer. Esther breaks the mold. And maybe some girl looks into my face tonight and you haven't fitted the mold at home, and you haven't fitted the mold in your local church, and you haven't fitted the mold in your society, and you haven't fitted the mold for a long time because you're different. You don't dress the same, you don't use the same language as other people think you should use, but you are the Lord's, and you are His child. And maybe you're a loner, and maybe you have very severe emotional and psychological problems that have made you the loner that you are, and maybe difficult to get on with. Yet you love the Lord. I am always very concerned in Northern Ireland with people who are the victims of religious feuding. It's something that greatly concerns me in this community in which I live and love. That while a whole lot of denominations and a whole lot of sects are fighting each other, there are young people who are caught in the blast and who flip out and go their own way. And it's not that they don't love the Lord, and it's not that they don't love His Word, and it's not that they are rebels against God, but they are sick and tired and fed up with denominational bickering and fighting and sectarianism. And they want to find reality and love and Christian love. And it's not easy for them. And maybe you are one of those people here tonight, bitter in your heart, really sore in your heart because of these kind of problems. I just want to show you that Esther doesn't fit the usual mold. And yet look how God used her. And God can use you in this community beyond all that you ever asked or thought. Not by disobeying His Word, not by throwing over the principles of God's Word, but by throwing over the traditions of men and obeying the Lord. You could bring a new day into this land, for we could do with it. I think she is a starlight of encouragement for somebody who is different. Okay, she was very beautiful. She was the most beautiful woman in the entire empire. But a girl said to me in England the other day, and her mother was sitting in the corner, I was having supper after having talked about Esther, and she looked at me and she said, well, you know, can you name any woman that God has really used in recent days? She started to go through famous people, Christian women who were famous because they had this or that or the other. And she said, well, even Esther, she was good looking. And what she was basically trying to say was, she said, you know, all these women had outstanding things about them. Johnny Erickson is a wonderful girl of courage. Despite disability, Esther was a good-looking woman who was used of God. Corrie ten Boom is famous because she was in the Ravensbrück camp. But what about your average person who doesn't have these things? And your average Christian woman who doesn't have these things? And I tried gently to remind her that when the gospel invaded Europe, where did it begin? Where did the gospel invade Europe? Where did it come first? Where did it start? In some great crusade, in some wonderful set-up campaign with some big-time preacher or whatever, and some huge organization? Some great blitz of an invasion on the city of Philippi? No. There was a woman who was a businesswoman in the city of Philippi who was longing to find God and went to a Jewish women's prayer meeting beside a river. And Paul didn't even stand up and preach to them. The Bible says he sat down. And he talked with these women. And the Bible puts it so beautifully. The Lord opened Lydia's heart. She became a Christian on the spot that very day. And she said, if you have judged me before the Lord, Paul, she said, you bring your friend Silas and you can come and stay in my home. And the Lord opened Lydia's heart. And Lydia opened her home, and God opened Philippi, and God opened Europe, and I'm standing here tonight because of that woman. She started it. The first convert, the first European convert to the gospel of Christ, who used what she had for God, and Lydia's heart and home became God's highway to Europe. Could your heart and home not be the same, ladies? In this province, filled with division and trouble, as well as positive things, of course. I just want to encourage you. She was different. And a whole lot of people wouldn't even want her, Esther, and would look down on her and look down upon this book. They have tried often, but God won't let them away with it. I am not condoning all that she did. But I am saying that God knew all about her and the circumstances that brought her to where she was and used her in them mightily. And as I've often said on Tuesday night, don't get a swelled head if the Lord uses you, because He uses some mighty strange people. And I love the way when Mordecai pleads with her, and you know, she equivocates and so on. God stands back from it. It's wonderful. The silence of God to look at it, it's deafening in the book. I find it wonderful, as you'll see in a moment. And even when the gallows are built for Mordecai, her cousin who raised her, and the whole thing is exactly 24 hours away from happening, that is, Mordecai being hung, God doesn't intervene with a word of comfort, or a word of inspiration, or a word of guidance, as at the Red Sea, or to little Samuel, or Elijah on the Mount. Doesn't happen. Esther and Mordecai are faced with the silence of God. There are plenty of people here tonight who know about the silence of God. Childless couples, single people, chronically ill watching me on this video, emotionally scarred people, deeply spiritual people who are looking for guidance, and the heavens are as brass and heaven is silent. It's a very real problem. What do you do when God does nothing, seemingly, and you've just got to go on with the mundane, everyday life, and nothing's happening on your problem and your heartache and your need for an answer? And you've got to go on, like Esther did, as we've seen in the study. You know, she fasted. They fasted before God, of course, for 3 days. And twice she is asked by the king, "What do you want?" When she decides to say, "If he kills me, he kills me. I'm going to ask for my people," she waits, and then she waits, and then she prepares this banquet, even while she's waiting. And the king says again, "What do you want?" In fact, 3 times he had to ask her, and she waits God's time. And that's very hard. See, that's why I read to you about Job, because the problem is raised in Esther, but in depth it is answered in the next book, one of the most relevant books to the 20th century, hardly ever preached from in the modern church, unfortunately. He loses everything he holds dear, his wealth, his health, his friends, the support of his friends, and his wife turns against him, which must be one of the most difficult things for any husband to face who knows and loves the Lord. And apparently, the very love of God turns away, the God that he had trusted for so long. And the great agony of Job is not the pain of his loss, as bad as that was. It's God's silence in the face of it all. But learn 2 things from Job and apply them also to Esther and to your life and my life tonight. 2 things are clarified when you're not getting an answer. Now, I know the usual answer is God says no, or God says yes, or God says wait. But I'm not particularly thinking of that tonight. I am thinking of those of you who are in a corner, who desperately need to do something. You need to make a decision about something, and you don't know what to do, and there is no answer. As a friend said recently to me, going through a trial, I find it awful hard to pray. Many Christians, when they are faced with tragedy and suffering and trial and difficulty, find it virtually impossible to even pray. There are 2 things that really clarify themselves when you are faced with the silence of God. First of all, it is clearly clarified in your life who God is. And secondly, who you are. That's what the silence of God does to your life. Get a hold of this, and it'll help you to tolerate or find more tolerable the silence of God. It'll get you the right perspective. As I say, the book of Esther raises the question. The book of Job very powerfully answers it over about 30 chapters and more. How do I say that? Who God is and who we are in the face of the silence of God. Well, when Job learned that he had been stripped of just about everything that he had, and he was an outstanding man in his country, everything that would make a fellow happy, he lost. And the first words he said when he was told he had lost everything were, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there." In other words, it was clarified who he was. And you see, that is exactly the thing that came to Esther whenever she was faced with, well, if the king doesn't lift his scepter to me, I'm dead. If I go into the court and he doesn't allow me to come, then of course I'm executed. You weren't allowed to wander in. And if he didn't like it, you were dead. She said, if I perish, I perish. She could get it clarified exactly where she was and her own worth. For the Lord's sake, she was prepared to lay down her life, and for the sake of the Lord's people. And if I perish, I perish. She could see eternal worth balanced over against her own situation. And what's Job saying? Well, Job is saying, well, look here. I had nothing when I arrived in this planet, and I won't have anything when I leave it. Everything I have lost wasn't my possession when I was born, and it wouldn't have been my possession when I die. It's like a fellow in America who had this joke big dollar bill pinned to his apartment wall, and it read, "If you can't take it with you, I'm not going." But that was no answer. Because the simple fact of the matter is that when you leave this earth, you can't take it with you. In the end, your life will have gone a full circle. You'll be right back where you started. Naked and helpless, you came into this world. No matter who you are tonight, or where you are from, or what sophistication you have arrived at of common culture or social culture or education. I don't care who you are or what you are, my friend. You came naked from your mother's womb into this world, and you will go back again to the same situation. You came into it with no one and nothing but God. And you will go out again into eternity the same way. And that's very clear. Not everybody has it that clear, do they? They don't see their lives as this. Well, what I had, I didn't own anyway. And okay, I have lost my house, or I've lost my business, or I've lost my child, or I've lost whatever. But I will have to realize that I was only loaned it in the first place by God. Oh, young people and men and women, and let me realize this, even in this ministry, I only have the torch for a little while, and soon I shall have to, in the will of God, pass it on to the next generation, and they will have their turn before the Lord comes or whatever, and then they will pass it on, but you and I only have our opportunities for a short period of time, loaned to us in whatever ministry we are in for the Lord if we are believers. But everybody in the world doesn't think like that. It wasn't the language of Senna, was it, on Sunday when he was racing at that first corner in the Japanese Grand Prix, and he drove right into Alain Prost. I noticed what Prost said about Senna. These two guys really haven't much love lost between them. Quote, "He has completely destroyed everything again. I thought he was one of the human race and fair on the track, but he was not. He just did not break, and he did it on purpose. With Senna, Formula One has become a real war. He is ready to risk death for the title. And anybody who saw the clip of film would reckon that Prost is right. Senna comes back and says, well, there was a gap, and he knows I'll always go for the gap. What an answer. At 120 miles an hour or whatever. Doesn't matter who's in the way. And that's the way people are. I thought those two fellas just epitomized a lot of what's in sport. My goodness, they're even finding managers at Arsenal now. And they sit there like wee boys in the corner. Because they can't stop their men fighting. They're no longer playing to enjoy a game of football. It's war, minus the shooting. So men fight and curse and risk a lot to get to the top for something they are going to leave behind. You think of where you are. Are you in this rat race? Am I in this rat race? How ridiculous that we don't care who we hurt, we don't care who gets in the way, we're going to have it. Face up to the reality tonight in God's presence of your mortality. If I perish, I perish. She realized that it could cost her her life, and in saving her life, she would have lost it, but in losing her life for the Lord's sake, she found it. I wonder, is there somebody here tonight and you have swallowed the modern culture? You are dressing up the reality of your mortality. You know you are going to die, but the last thing in the world you want to think about is that. You know you only have a short time, but the last thing you want to realize is that stark fact. You say you're being morbid. No, I'm being realistic. When you are faced with losing things in life, this will greatly help you. And I'm speaking particularly to believers now. It'll greatly help you to face up to your loss. Are you hiding in wealth? Well, if you are, Job was the wealthiest man of his times, and he lost it all. Are you hiding in your intelligence and your wisdom? Job was the wisest man of his peers. Are you hiding in your youth and in your health? Well, Job was once young and very healthy. Are you hiding in your loved ones and your friends around you? Everybody loved Job. Are you hiding in your moral goodness and faith? Well, Job was unequaled in his moral goodness and in his faith. Nothing is immune to death, and nothing is immune to suffering. Let's remember that. And you won't get that guy on the phone tomorrow and scorch him with your tongue if you realize that he could be dead by the end of the day. You won't lift that pen of yours and write that miserable letter if you would stop for a minute to think, well, my hand might be cold in death before that fella gets that letter. Or that girl gets that letter. You know not, and I know not, what a day may bring forth. Teach us to number our days, says David, that we might apply our hearts unto wisdom. This is wisdom I'm talking about tonight. And Job does not add to his suffering by believing that his loss is a great miscarriage of justice. Nor does Esther in the book before say it's a great miscarriage of justice. And if I go in before the king and plead with him, as she's now about to do in this chapter, and actually speak it, I may lose my life. You'll notice that she even says, when she makes the petition in chapter 7, she says to the king, if I have found favor, verse number 3, in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition. This girl knew very well that she could lose her life by asking for what she was going to ask for. But she doesn't go on and on about the fact that she feels that, this is a great personal sacrifice on her part. See, you and I should not go around, and I should not go around protesting against losing anything, for nothing is ours in the first place. Job suffered loss, and that was burden enough to tax the strength of the strongest. You've suffered loss, that's a very real thing, and that's a very heavy grief. That's enough to carry without adding to it. Nothing Job had, but was a gift to him from God. And of course, isn't that lovely, the way he says it? Out it comes. He says, I came in naked, I'll go out naked. I mean, you think of the guy who built the Spruce Goose, that huge plane that still sits in America. Howard Hughes, one of the wealthiest men in the world. And when he died, one of the wealthiest men in the world, the Methodist minister preached at his graveside on the text, we brought nothing into this world, and it certain will take nothing out. Brave man. Brave man. The Lord gives, said Job, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And when Job was faced with his losses, he did not first say that the Lord took them away. He said the Lord was the one who first gave. And then he took them away. And Job's belief that God is generous and kind beyond measure imparted to him extraordinary grace and poise amidst his suffering and his waiting. Of course, that's not 20th century thinking, is it? The Lord give, and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I came into this world naked. I'll go back out the same way. Everything I have I was given. Let me appreciate it while I have it. That's not 20th century living. 20th century living is all about rights. It's all about rights. People are marching for a right to this, a right to that, a right to the other thing. Everybody seems to think that they have certain rights. The right to be happy, the right to a standard of living, the right to health and pleasure, the right to a happy marriage, the right to a fulfilling job. But that's not what the Bible teaches. We came into this world with nothing. We leave this world with nothing. Whatever we have because God in His grace and generosity gave it to us. And when we realize this, then there comes into our lives a joyful gratitude for what we do have. And we are freed from resentment and anxiety over what we do not have. If you cut down a whole lot of your expectations, you would slay your disappointments, and you'd be a lot happier. But we're living in a world which is driving all the time for expecting this and expecting that and expecting the other. Life is a riddle. I know it is. It was a riddle for Esther. She didn't know all that was going on, and Job didn't. And there's a whole lot of things in this life we will never solve this side of eternity. And Satan taunted God and said, that fella Job loves you, but he doesn't love you for nothing. You give him a whole lot of perks, and he'd be a fool not to love you. Take away his perks and his benefits, and he'll curse you. But that didn't happen. For Job proved the accuser wrong, that a person can love the Lord even though they get nothing out of it. And he found in God everything he needed, even though God was silent for a very long time. Now, I've spent quite a while on Job, but I think he's a beautiful example of this principle. And what are we learning then from Esther? What are we learning from her? Well, we're learning God's timing. God is silent, 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 silent at all of these stages. But now comes the time when Esther moves and asks the king to free her people. And what are we learning? Well, we're learning that there's a time when God would have us move, and there is a time when God doesn't want us to move. You see, we measure everything objectively. If you want to Find out what the day is going to be. You look at for the day you look at your watch, and for the month you look at your calendar or your work schedule, for the year into your calendar. Everything we measure is from the present moment. You're measuring your life this week from this moment. That is our constant orientation, this moment. But God's time isn't bound by a wristwatch and wall calendars. God doesn't have a calendar up on his wall and look down it and say, now it's time to do this and that and the other, as we do. God's time is infinitely immeasurable. God transcends time. It's intangible, his time. Look, we look on history as a kind of a set of still frames, but God sees the whole movie from beginning to end. He knows the whole thing, as in a motion picture reel. At once, he can see the whole thing at once, the end from the beginning. And we're measuring, well now, if the Lord doesn't move today, and it's such and such a time, and he doesn't do it this month, where are we going to be? We think that time is consciously accountable. You know, your friend was there. You saw it, Mary, you saw it, Tom. Events are visible. People present, witnessing what's said and done. Everything in our time is accounted for by who was there or who wrote it down. But you can't do that with God. See God's time and your time. God can see beyond the immediate and the tangible events. We rarely ignore time. The only time you really ignore time is when you're asleep or when you're daydreaming. That's the only time you really escape from time. Yet you can't escape entirely from time. It's only a jaunt that's mental. Physically, you're still a captive of time. But that's not true of God. That's why God can remain silent in scene one, because he knows the final act and how it's going to turn out. He doesn't need to say everything in scene one. But we're trapped in time. And because we're trapped in time, we feel that God is unfair. Only at the end of time, after we have attained God's level of viewing, after every evil has been punished and forgiven, and after every illness has been healed and the entire universe restored, only then will fairness reign. And we'll understand the role that was played by evil and by the fall and by the natural law. And until then, we will not know, and we can only trust the God who does know. We remain ignorant of the details. God does not enjoy keeping us in the dark any more than he enjoyed keeping Esther and Mordecai in the dark, even up until those last moments before Mordecai seemed to be almost on the gallows. God doesn't enjoy keeping us in the dark. We are in the dark because we haven't got the faculties to absorb so much light. If you knew everything, it would bring chaos into the world. Total chaos. And anyway, if you knew everything that was going to happen to you, you mightn't want to live next week. God in his mercy shields you from the future. Listen to this. Faith means believing in advance what will only make sense in reverse. Believing in advance what will only make sense in reverse. God was silent all of this time with these people, but his silences were just as significant as the time when he spoke. But it won't be like that always in your life. My mom used to say to me, son, she used to say, things never remain the same very long. And I'm learning that. When you're young, you say, oh, I wish they'd hurry up. I wish things would move and things would happen. Learn it. Things in life do not remain the same very long. Here is the king, and we dealt with it last week. He couldn't sleep. He read the history books and discovered that Mordecai had saved his life in the past and hadn't been rewarded for it. Event number one. And then subtly the events begin to change. There's a sudden change in plans. Esther comes in and speaks, even though she hasn't spoken to the king for the two significant times before. Suddenly, events begin to change. And even this very night, in the depth of your circumstance, events might start to change in the most subtle way. And even though God is silent, He can still move events and ride upon the storm and plant His footsteps in the storm. It wasn't the right time before to speak, but it is the right time now, and she senses it. Are you a sensitive Christian? Because you have a lot of information, doesn't mean you have to say it all. I mean, I could give examples of people, you even prod them a little and they'll go through Romans for you, sitting in the waiting room for the doctor, to the embarrassment of everybody around. Or they'll start preaching, or whatever. So many people go too far, even in witnessing. I remember one day there was a wee fella at one meeting, children's meeting I happened to be taking, and there were so many kids came, the wee fella went through the plate glass window, queuing up. The rest of the queue were pushing him. So he was rushed off to hospital. Can you imagine how I felt? I wasn't there, I kept preaching. You see, I got off. But because I had to take the service, but somebody else had to take the heat and took the little lad to the hospital, one of the elders of the church, and he sat down beside this man who was an ambulance man. And he said, hello, and what happened here? And this kid was at a children's meeting, and where do you worship on Sunday? Well, that got the guy started. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights. My friend came to me, he said, I was waiting, he says, with this little boy who was hurt, and this guy's telling me how right he is, and how truthful he is, and how right according to the word he is, and he goes down the list to an embarrassment. It's true, some people go far too far. Somebody offers you a cigarette. You say, well, I don't smoke. They'll put you in your grave. They're cancer weeds. They'll put the nail in your coffin. You shouldn't do that. It's rotting your chest. Mister, all it did was offer you a fag. Somebody offers you a drink and says, don't drink the miserable stuff. Well, neither do I. But, because somebody offers me a drink doesn't mean to say he's being nasty. In his terms, he's being friendly. And would it not be just good to say to him, well, I don't drink whiskey, but I'm very partial to ginger beer and lime. If you say to an unconverted person, are you coming to play chess? They don't say, I don't like the miserable game, it's horrible, it's terrible, I would rather race horses. They say, no, I don't like chess. But you know how we are, we're so jumpy. Because you have a lot of information doesn't mean you have to say it all. And she had a lot of information against Haman. She could have had him twice before, but she says nothing. She holds back. She waits God's time. And what a change. As God moves the circumstances, she senses it's now time to move. And don't you ever tell me, friend, that things in this world are permanent, because they aren't. Just look at the Berlin Wall. Goodness, I walked around that wall in the past, frightened out of my mind, looking at it, and all those young people who came across it and lost their lives. We thought it would never fall, but it fell in a night. And now a nation is united over the flattened wall. And they're selling chunks of it as period pieces all over the world. God can alter kings' edicts. God can change people's minds. God can move nations around. God can take a Haman and have him hung on the gallows meant for Mordecai within a whisker of time. He comes in to tell the king to hang Haman or to hang Mordecai, and before the day is out, the king says, hang him. The world calls it irony. God calls it sovereignty. There is no such a thing, really, in a Christian's vocabulary as the word coincidental. It's not coincidental. And notice, friends, that the king's anger subsided. Whenever Esther comes in, she tells him there is this desperate plot against her and her people. And he says, who is this man? And she says, there he is there. He is so angry, he goes out for a wee walk round the garden. Can you see him? Seething. Comes back in, here's Haman out over the couch, pleading with Esther for his very life. How events have changed. But it's God's time now. And he comes in and he thinks that this fella is trying to attack his wife. He says, are you going to do this even when I am in the palace? And one of his men come along, and it's hardly out of his mouth, and they put a blindfold, it seems to me, around Haman immediately. And they say, see those gallows over there? He's had those put up. Those gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good to the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. And the king says, hang him on it. And events are changed in seconds. And they will be in your life. Notice that amazing little statement there. Then the king's wrath subsided. Isn't that what happens? Whenever God moves, and you got so mad at the silence of God, and then suddenly you say, oh Lord, I'm sorry that I panicked. I'm sorry that I tried to manipulate. I am sorry, I am sorry, I am sorry. What I did, Lord, if I had only been content to wait. And your anger subsides. Think of this principle. Here are some disciples. They have rowed for 10 hours and they've only got 3 miles. And the storm gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And where's Christ? Up on the mountain praying at a prayer meeting. And the non-Christian says, typical Christians. While they pray, these guys are drowning. Here is Jairus. His little girl is dying. Christ says he'll come and help her. On the way, a woman with a hemorrhage stops him. So he stops to preach her a little message, and while he's talking and preaching to her, Jairus' servant says, don't come, don't bother the master, the wee girl's dead. How do you think Jairus felt? Why didn't he hurry up? Here's Mary and Martha. They are waiting for Christ to come and see one of his best friends, their brother Lazarus, and he doesn't come. In fact, he deliberately waits until he dies. And then he deliberately waits beyond the death and doesn't go to the funeral and arrives when he's in the grave. And Mary and Martha, they find Christ coming down the road, and they look at him and they said, if you had been here, our brother wouldn't have died. Imagine scolding God for being late, who never had a planet late yet. If you had only hurried up, Lord, do you not see it from our standpoint? If you had been here, our brother wouldn't have died. Couldn't Jairus have said that? If you'd only come, my little girl wouldn't have died. Couldn't those disciples have said that? If you had only come, we wouldn't have been half drowned. But why did the Lord wait? Why was he silent? Because he wanted to teach those disciples that he had power over nature. And he came on the water and stilled it. He wanted to teach Jairus that not only could he heal a sick child, but he could raise a dead child. And not only did he want to teach Mary and Martha that he could raise a dead brother, he waited until their dead brother's body was decomposing to prove to them that he could not only raise one who had just died, but he could raise a decomposed body. So if the Lord had answered all of the prayers of these people in the time sequence they had wanted, they would have learnt that he had power over nature, etc., in a way, and power over healing and power over death. But because the Lord stayed back and was silent and came in his time, they learned a whole lot more. Are you trying to tell me that your God is cruel? And that his silence about who you should marry, his silence about what job you should have, what house you should live in, what situation you should be in, his holding back in giving you answers to these things, his cruelty, learn the lesson of Haman's Last Supper. Despite the last long silence, God's timing was perfect. You see, people's problems are not so much the circumstances they live under, but the principles they live by. And he was living by the wrong principle, and it caught up with him. He got his due reward. Be not deceived, God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. And Jacob deceived his old father. And what happened? He thought he was clever, so clever, until one day, many years later, his own sons came and deceived him with a coat dipped in goat's blood. And he thought, Joseph's dead, and he started to cry. The very thing that he had done to his father, his own sons did to him. And one day that wicked Saul lifted his javelin, and the Bible says he wanted to pin David to the wall with a javelin. When he died, killed by the Philistines, or committed suicide in a battle with the Philistines cut his head off, and the Bible says they took his trunk and they pinned it to the wall. And even Saul of Tarsus, who stoned Stephen and seemed to delight in it, was one day stoned himself and left for half dead. Got to be careful. Just because you're a Christian and you know the Lord doesn't mean to say we can do what we like and don't have to face the consequences of the things that we do in this life. We're not talking about losing the soul now. But if you hurt someone, that hurt will remain, even though you have become a Christian. As when people who get saved in this province, who have killed people, and then parents say on the media, well, he didn't give my son a chance to get saved when he gunned him down. And the poor person who has done that and is now repented of it has to live with the consequences of that. What a surprise for Haman. Sovereignly designed. God surprises. And learn this, and let me learn it, and never forget it. The workings of our God are related to our crises, not to our clocks. That is the story of Esther 7. God was working though silent. He was working though absent. But his workings were related powerfully to their crisis, not related to their clocks. In other words, he moved in his time. Their job was to be faithful, and they were. And look what happened. These are deep principles, but they're powerful ones, and may the Lord lay them on your heart.